Good afternoon. My name is Leticia Sanches. I am a Spanish musicologist and an independent researcher. First of all, I would like to say that I really appreciate the opportunity to participate in this conference about the composer Roberto Gerhard. The aim of my contribution to this conference is to provide a biographical approach to Gerhard's first decade of exile, and I will also analyze his ideological commitment to the Catalan cause. A new life in exile, first months in France. Roberto Gerhard's exile was not planned. At the end of 1938, he traveled with his wife, Oldie, to Warsaw as a member of the jury for the festival organized by the International Society for Contemporary Music. Meanwhile, Franco's army invaded Barcelona, and his brother, Carles Gerhard, exiled to France with their mother. Because of his own political significance, the composer feared for his life and settled temporarily in Paris, where he worked on the final touches to his ballet Suárez de Barcelona. Gerhard's economic situation was very precarious, and he hoped to premiere his ballet in London that summer. From the beginning of his exile, Gerhard was also very upset about the attitude of the international community, especially the English government and press, about Franco, because they supported the dictator for economic reasons, discrediting the Spanish Republic. Roberto Gerhard confessed, "Pessimism begins to invade me regarding our country." A fairy tale, the scholarship at Cambridge. On March 1939, Gerhard received a letter from his old friend Edward Dent about the possibility of obtaining a research grant at Cambridge University. There were some difficulties since the scholarship had an academic character, and Gerhard was mainly a practical musician, but Dent's recommendation played a key role to secure the scholarship for Gerhard. The composer soon made up his mind to move to England, because of the pre-war feeling in France and his own economical uncertainties. The conditions of the scholarship at Cambridge were very appealing to Gerhard, and the composer thought, in his own words, that he could put up with English climate better than with Franco rule. Gerhard considered his scholarship at Cambridge as a temporal solution, since it was for 1 year only, and kept his apartment in Barcelona until July 1939, when he was forced to leave it. But he kept his belongings in a storage room in Barcelona, with the idea of returning to Catalonia in the future. Gerhard settled down in Cambridge in June 1939, with hardly any possessions in a single suitcase. Less than 2 months after, World War II broke out. Gerhard initially hoped a diplomatic solution could be found before it turned into full-scale war, but he was obviously mistaken. Adapting to England. After his intense social life, political and musical life in Barcelona during the previous years, Gerhard disliked the tranquil university life. During his life in Cambridge, Gerhard also suffered health problems that were not medically treated given his limited income. Despite his feeling of ruthlessness, Gerhard had an active social life in Cambridge. However, his adaptation to England was difficult. He found the weather, especially the lack of sunshine, and the cool British temperament difficult to accept. He kept hoping to return to Catalonia. The Catalan cause. Gerhard's commitment to the Catalan cause remained throughout the decade, particularly during the early years. He kept close to the Catalan National Council in London. It was the Catalan government in exile. Its members were exiled Catalan nationalists who worked for the recognition of the Catalan rights by the Allies. Dr. Josep Trueta was one of the most important members of the Catalan National Council in London, and he visited the Gerards weekly. Gerard also made an effort to spread among his English friends the news and opinions of Catalan exiles, but he often mistrusted the success of the nationalism and expressed his differences with some Catalan exiles. Throughout the 40s, Gerard continued his activities supporting Catalanism, making a great effort to stay informed about the situation in Catalonia. He also tried to help some exiles trapped in the south of France, especially Pau Casals. In 1945, Gerard was still very connected to the Catalan cause and accepted an offer from the composer Josep Valls to participate in a Catalan cultural project. This project was probably the seed for the reactivation of the Catalan section in the International Society for Contemporary Music. Gerard's first decade in exile, fighting against discouragement. In May 1940, Gerard received an invitation to renew his scholarship at Cambridge. However, payment by the university was slow in coming, and Gerard had many debts. To make matters worse, the composer was also extremely troubled by the lack of news of his family. In that same year, there was also the possibility that Gerard would be arrested and transferred to a British internment camp. Many refugees residing in England were being confined in these places despite the fact many had fled from Nazi persecution. Gerard did not seem overly worried by this possibility, although he knew the British were considering the internment of Spanish refugees and those of other nationalities. He wrote, "I don't deny the idea that a concentration camp couldn't form part of a number in the program, but it seems to me to belong to the last act." Gerard had retained his Swiss passport, and he most likely felt that this would protect him from internment due to Swiss neutrality. Given these realities, Gerard exploited the Hispanic mood in his work. His use of Catalan folkloric material could be seen as a musical manifestation of Gerard's political and pro-Catalan ideology, an updated and personal vision. For example, during the 40s and 50s, the Franco regime had tried to strip the sardana of its nationalist significance, and sardanism was converted into cultural resistance. From his exile, Gerard reclaimed the sardana as a song of liberty and a symbol of Catalan identity. That may be the reason why he composed his new arrangement of the first sardana, and also why he used this dance's rhythm in his violin concerto. At the end of the 40s, the Gerards moved in with the Fernandez Shaw family. They could not afford to rent a house of their own, and for 2 years lived on a shoestring. Gerard gave piano lessons and Poldi helped out with the housekeeping. Furthermore, by the end of the decade, Gerard's first serious health problems began, including a heart condition which would eventually kill him in 1970. Gerard's first visit to Catalonia. In the middle of the 40s, Gerard had not yet discarded the idea of returning to live in Spain. He was still hoping for the rapid fall of Franco regime after the end of World War II. In 1947, Gerard's mother died without the composer having been able to see her during the preceding 10 years. He mourned her grievously, and for a time was unable to work due to depression. In the composer's own words, "To the pain of having lost my sweet mother, is added the bitterness that I could not say goodbye to her. I have never felt exile as cruelly as I do now. Between 1939 and 1948, Gerard didn't attempt any communication with friends in Catalonia, for fear they could suffer reprisals owing to his letters. He only maintained contact with his younger brother Ferran, whom he visited for the first time in the summer of 1948. After nearly a decade of exile, this first visit to Spain left Gerard and his wife dejected and depressed at the devastated state of the country. He wrote, "We found the country in a shocking state. The economic situation seems to be chaotic. That's what the bastard has done to the country." The Catalan section of the International Society for Contemporary Music. In 1945, Gerard tried to reactivate the Catalan section of the International Society for Contemporary Music to raise the visibility of Spanish Republican exiles with the political purpose of legitimizing the Republic in opposition to the Francoist regime. Since 1932, the Spanish section of the International Society was organized in two independent groups, one settled in Madrid and the other in Barcelona. Therefore, after negotiating with important members of the International Society for Contemporary Music, Gerard wrote to Óscar Esplà, former president of the Spanish section, to propose its reactivation. Esplà accepted the proposal, including the presidency of the Spanish section. Gerard wanted to keep pre-Civil War structure in order to avoid, in his own words, a centralist system. In 1946, the new Hispano-Catalan section of exiles was approved. 2 years later, Gerard was named president of the Catalan section and vindicated himself after a bitter dispute with Esplà the previous year, who had expressed his reservations about Gerard's right to participate as a member of the Spanish section, questioning his nationality. The letter with Gerard's reactions to Esplà's accusations explains his position regarding nationality, an issue which was and remains controversial. From an administrative point of view, the issue held little interest for Gerard. Emotionally, he considered himself clearly Catalan. He wrote to Esplà, "I see no difference at all between discriminating against a person because of his nationality or because of his race or color. I, as the disciple that I was of Pedrell for a period of 6 years, belong to the school that is illustrated with names you know, and I confess that I am proud to belong to it." Shortly thereafter, as Gerard had feared, the Spanish section became centralized and subsequently remodeled and controlled by Francoism by the mid-50s, in part due to the actions of Esplà himself. The former section of exiled Spanish Republicans was expelled, but they maintained their right as independent composers. The situation led to confrontation between Gerard and Esplà, given that the latter had been negotiating his return to Spain with the Francoist government since 1948, a fact unknown to Gerard. Gerard's compositions during his first decade in exile, forced labors for survival. During his first year at Cambridge, Gerard lived on the little money provided by his scholarship and the programs commissioned by the BBC on the great works and composers of Spanish music. Later in the decade, Gerard also arranged zarzuelas, light Spanish songs, and incidental music for BBC radio programs intended for Hispanic audiences. These arrangements represented an important part of his production during these years, but Gerard considered them forced labors for survival, and initially he signed them with a pseudonym. Gerard accepted to compose these works out of financial necessity, but they helped him to improve his orchestral technique and also offered Gerard the opportunity to learn more about zarzuela and its melodic richness, which he explored with interest and used in his later career. Gerard had at his disposal the radio orchestra, with its first-class soloists, and could hear his work performed within a brief period of time. Gerard also composed incidental music for radio plays based on works of well-known authors. During the following 2 decades, this represented an important source of income which lasted until the mid-60s. Symphonic music. In February 1940, Gerard began to compose his concerts for violin and orchestra, but it remained unfinished for a number of years and wasn't premiered until 1950. The concerto is practically the only work of this period that Gerard did not compose as a commission. Both Berg's violin concert and Sibelius' Fifth Symphony formally influenced the piece. Gerard took advantage of a compositional technique that, if not exactly serial, used a series of 9 and 12 notes in a chromatic context, while integrating Catalan folkloric melodies and the rhythm of a sardana. Michael Rouse reveals the autobiographical nature of this work, emphasizing the influence of the composer's personal experiences during his first decade in exile, far beyond the political and social climate of the period. Gerard himself wrote about this violin concerto. It became intensely autobiographical. I simply could not avoid the past resuscitating in every one of its dim faces and faces. Between 1941 and 1942, Gerard composed 2 works to celebrate the centenary of the birth of his former teacher, Felipe Pedrell. One of these works is the symphony Homenaje a Pedrell, based on themes from his teacher's opera La Celestina. This symphony, apart from being a homage to his first teacher, also had an underlying symbolic and metaphoric reference to the fate of Spain. Gerard described it. The symphony of the Celestina, full of tragic love and frustration, is perhaps an echo of the tragedy of a country. He explains the structure of his symphony in a letter to Joseph Valls. I have spent a lifetime arguing Pedrell's case with people who denied him his worth as a composer. Now I plan to argue with music. All the themes used in my symphony are from La Celestina. The development is entirely mine. I consider the result a kind of extensive essay on some of Pedrell's ideas that I find brilliant and highly expressive. The coda is a kind of postdata that is entirely my own. Gerard had hoped the BBC would broadcast Homenaje a Pedrell in 1941, but he was bitterly disappointed. Later, in 1945, he reworked the final movement of the work in order to be performed separately, that coda he was explaining here, although without modifying the cyclical references to the first 2 movements. And he called this new work Pedrelliana. The BBC orchestra performed it that same year. Gerard's ballets and opera. Gerard's ballets and opera are probably his main productions of the period. I have studied them in depth in the biography of Gerard that I wrote and published in 2013. But due to the lack of time, I will just mention them briefly now. During Gerard's first decade in exile, he composed a number of ballets, all of which were conditioned by the realities of wartime shortages. Shortly after he moved to Cambridge, Gerard began to compose Don Quixote, one of the most remarkable works of the first part of his life in exile. His main motivations were his artistic interest in ballet, together with his eagerness to succeed and gain public recognition and economical security. The relevance of Don Quixote in Gerard's production was reflected in the innovative musical treatment of the main character. Gerard wrote, "Nobody, as far as I know, has up until now remarked upon the incredible value the serial technique possesses. Needless to say that for me, Don Quixote is the night of the invisible images." Gerard completed his ballet in 1940, but it remained unperformed until it was staged in 1950s. It was also reworked a number of times. The first version of the ballet was transformed into a suite, first performed in late 1941. Shortly after his arrival in Cambridge, on July 1939, Gerard received a commission from the Rambert Ballet Company to write Andalusian-themed music. Very likely, the idea was to arrange pre-existing music. The work was far from his aesthetic values, but Gerard accepted the commission out of financial necessity. The project, however, didn't see the light of day until 1942, when a reworked version was presented as the Ballet Flamenco, premiered in that same year. Shortly afterwards, Gerard transformed it into the orchestral suite Alegrías. He was obliged to compose it in flamenco style and recreate, with some irony, the cliché typical of Andalusian sound. The harmonic treatment, however, remains typical of the composer. The BBC Orchestra premiered the orchestral version of the piece in April 1944. Between 1943 and 1944, Gerard also composed the ballet Pandora, premiered in an orchestral version between 1943 and 1944, Gerard also composed the ballet Pandora, which has an anti-fascist content. Gerard produced two versions, one for two pianos and percussion, and the other for orchestra. He would later transform it into a suite. Pandora is dedicated to Alice Roughton, protector and friend of Gerard, who in her last years provided him with a house where he could compose and live. Thanks to her connections, Pandora was premiered. Additionally, these years saw Gerard undertake a ballet project based on La Mojiganga de la Muerte by the 17th century Spanish writer Calderón de la Barca, and another on Ventura Gasol's Narcisse. Neither work was brought to completion. Gerard's compositions during these years include his soul opera, The Duenna, set to a libretto by an 18th century British playwright. Gerard was drawn to the text because of its great possibilities for success with British audiences. He included stylistic references to the 18th century scenic tonadillas that he knew so well through his work with Pedrell. Gerard hoped this comic opera would give him a financial and professional triumph in England. The composer earned very little in terms of money or recognition through his ballets, and had therefore placed a great deal of hope in the Duenna. The opera, however, was not performed. The concert version was broadcast live from BBC studios and the Duena would not be premiered as a stage opera until 1949. At that time, the Duena and Gerard's three ballets were the only works offered live to the English public since the composer had arrived in the country. None of these works achieved the response and success the author had hoped for to secure his financial and artistic position in the country that had taken him in. Gerard's first decade of exile was a hard period of his life, full of economic difficulties, health problems, and feelings of isolation and ruthlessness. But he did not renounce neither his Catalan identity nor his struggle for the freedom of the Catalans, and never returned to live in Franco's Spain. Thanks for your attention.